When Servius Tullius came to power, he understood what had happened to the previous king was likely to happen to him, and he decided to take steps that would protect his reign. Unfortunately, the steps he took to secure his reign ended up becoming the seeds of his downfall. And these steps also ended up becoming like the foundation of a very evil reign that came after his. I welcome you to my YouTube channel where I explore ancient texts, and ancient texts here I mean texts that have been around for thousands of years. Right now I'm going through the book From the Founding of the City by Titus Livius or Livy. This is a collection of books actually that were written by Livy about 2000 years ago. And the books cover a period of the history of Rome of about 700 to 800 years, from around 720 BCE to 0 AD or 0 BC, whatever you like. So if you've not subscribed, please subscribe so that you don't miss any of the videos that I publish. Plus, that will also help me reach a wider audience. Now, Servius Tullius was the 6th king of Rome, and he came after Romulus, who was the first king who ruled from 750 BCE to around 716 BCE. And Romulus was followed by the 2nd king Pompilius, and there was the 3rd king Tullus Hostilius, the 4th king Ancus Marcius, then the 5th king Tarquinius Priscus. We've discussed, or I've recorded videos about the reigns of these kings. Now, Servius comes to power around 570s BCE. And I've described in another video how he came to power. There was a general understanding in Rome that he was a child of a slave who used to work in the household of the previous king, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. Now, Servius is the king, and he understood that there was a general, or there was this, there was a way that people saw him, and he was vulnerable, especially because there was this story that he was a son of a slave. And he also understood that it was possible for the sons of Lucius Tarquinius Priscus to come for this throne, because that had happened before. And now he decides to prevent that from happening. And what he does, he goes ahead and he marries his two daughters to two sons of Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. Now, Livy doesn't tell us whether Servius had other kids. He doesn't really mention that, but he talks about these two daughters, and one of the daughters went by the name Tullia. And of course, now he marries these two daughters to the sons of Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, and the reason he does this is so that the sons of Lucius Tarquinius Priscus become family, and as family he hoped that they were not going to conspire against him, especially them marrying or having his daughters as their wives. He was assured that they were going to behave appropriately. What he didn't realize is that these sons were not going to be a problem, even if he had not given them his daughters to marry. In fact, by giving them his daughters, he made the problem he was trying to avoid become real. And in fact, the real evil was in his own household, not out there. But he didn't think that. He thought the problem was out there, so he needed to take care of it. In fact, using members of his own family. But it turned out he needed to look inwards more than looking outwards. Now, one of the two daughters, the way Livy describes it, was very greedy for power. That is Tullia, and this is the one he keeps talking about mostly. He says that she was so greedy for power that nothing will stand in her way, not even her own father. In fact, she was so determined to get to the throne, not herself, because it wasn't the custom of the Romans to have women as queens or kings, if you may. So she wanted to use somebody she could control to be the king, or she wanted to have somebody she could control be on the throne. And now the man she married was Arruns. And Livy tells us that Arruns, in fact, both Arrun and the brother, and I need to mention this, that the brothers were Arruns Tarquinius and Lucius Tarquinius. So whenever it is important for me to differentiate Lucius Tarquinius the father and Lucius Tarquinius the son. Now, the first person, okay, she was married to Arruns, that is Tullia. But there was a problem. She was so greedy, she wanted to get to the throne, but the husband wasn't. And in fact, the way Livy describes things, turns out that both the brothers were not really interested in getting to power. But mostly Arrun was not at all. He was the least interested in getting to power. But this is the guy that Tullia he gets married to. And in fact, Tullia attempts to persuade Arun to be interested in power, but she's not successful, and that's because Livy describes Arruns as a youth of gentle disposition. He was generally a person who wasn't very aggressive, you might say, and Tullia will often be heard saying, and Livy does provide us with some quotes, that she at least once was quoted saying, "If the gods had given me the man I deserved, I would soon have seen my own house. I would sooner have seen in my own house the royal power, which now I see in my father's." So she was quoted saying that. So she's kind of like she was complaining that the gods did not give her the husband she deserved. So after trying so many times to persuade Arruns to be interested in power, she gave up, and she decided to talk to the brother Lucius, who was also, by the way, her brother-in-law, because Lucius was married to her sister. And even though initially Lucius seemed to have also not been interested in political power, but he was easy to persuade. At least Lucia found it easy to persuade, Tullia found it easy to persuade Lucius to be interested in political power. So they continued talking, and slowly Lucius was coming around and was finding the idea of him being king interesting. And he, of course, as the more he entertained the idea, the more he thought he needed to do something about it. But that was to come later. Other things would happen first. Tullia was not going to help someone become a king if it wasn't someone she would control or she would have within a very inner circle, you might say. So Tullia started saying that, or started planting the idea that the wife Lucius said was not the right wife for him, and that was her own sister, of course. And she started planting these doubts in Lucius that he had a good wife. But Livy tells us that of the two sisters, the other was the gentle one. They were very opposite in character. That was Livy tells us. That means while Tullia was so aggressive and wanted to get into political office, her sister was gentle and wasn't really interested in that. Now, before long, Tullia starts an affair with Lucius Tarquinius Jr., I might say, or it's so to differentiate him from his father. So she starts this clandestine affair with Lucius that goes on for a moment, and at some point Tullia tells Lucius that they were a perfect match, and in fact she started calling him a man and a prince. And she despised her sister because, having not a man for a mate, she lacked a woman's daring. That's how she described the sister. Like, the sister was not really qualified to be Lucia's wife. And so she decided, or they decided, that it was better if they married and they became a couple. But there was a problem, of course. Lucius was still married to the sister of Tullia, and Tullia was still married to the brother of Lucius, Arruns. So seems like the way Livy describes it, it wasn't something that was acceptable to divorce and marry them. I think because divorce is not mentioned anywhere by Livy anyways. So the only way out for them to get married or to become a couple, that's Tullia and Lucius, was for their partners to go. And in fact, they get rid of that obstacle of them being married to other people, and they do that by having them killed, basically, or dead. Livy doesn't tell us how they do it, but he does make it very clear that they were murdered by these two individuals. Once the two were out of the way, the two married, and that was the first step for them to get into power. So they marry, and Livy describes the marriage as one that Servius tolerated more than approved. So Servius didn't really approve this marriage, but he kind of tolerated it. Servius is still the king, of course. Servius is the father of Tullia. Servius is the father-in-law to Lucius. Now, he tolerated this marriage. He doesn't really approve it. Not long after this marriage had been, the two are a couple now. That's Lucius and Tullia. Lucius starts attacking the legitimacy of Servius as the king, and he starts talking about his origins, of him being a child of a slave or a son of a slave, and how that wasn't appropriate for Rome, or that was not okay, or it wasn't okay for Rome to have someone who was a son of a slave being the king. And Servius became uncomfortable, of course, with with these attacks, and he decided to consolidate his power more. And the way he did that, he goes and he starts subdividing land that the Romans had conquered from their enemies, and he subdivides it and gives it out to the commons. And that also becomes a source of missile, you can say, that Lucius will use against the king, because now he starts telling the kings, he starts telling the senators that the king was pandering more to the commons, and he was doing this at the expense of the senators and the nobility, of course, or people of the noble class. He also talks about how Servius hated the nobles so much that he came up with the idea of census, which I talked about in a previous video. And this idea was to subdivide the population into classes, and then these classes were based on the wealth that people owned, and people with more wealth were put in a different class. And then Lucius says that the king did that so that the people with the nobility, or the people in the noble class, will pay more tax basically and will have more responsibilities. So he used this to show that Servius hated the nobles, and of course the senators belonged in that class. Meanwhile, while Lucius is attacking Servius, his wife Tullia, was kind of like taunting him and trying to fuel his activity of trying to bring down the king. And in fact, he was telling him if he doesn't act, then he's a coward. Those are some of the. In fact, Livy does quote him saying, if you are he whom I thought I was marrying, I call you both man and king. If not, then I have so far changed for the worse, in that crime is added in your case to cowardice. Like, yeah, if you are the man I thought I married, then you are king, you are a man and a king. But otherwise, then I will add cowardice among the things I can use to describe you. So with these kinds of taunts, Lucius became even more aggressive in attacking Servius. And he went to senators who I've talked about in another video, who were appointed by his father, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus had appointed more individuals to become senators, and these senators came to be known as the senators of the lesser families. I've talked about this in another video. Now he goes to these senators who were appointed by his own father, and he talks to them, and he reminds them that it is his father who made them senators. So he kind of was expecting them to do something for him, to be on his side at least. He also started bribing young men with gifts and promising them even more goodies if he ever becomes the king of Rome. And he does all this, and then one day he surrounds himself with a body of armed men, and they go to the Senate. And he walks to the Senate, and he sits on the throne, and he sends out a message to all senators to come to the Senate. And some of the senators already knew what was happening. They were informed, especially those who belonged to the group of the lesser families. Others didn't know, but they came and they were fearful to act or to say anything against Lucius, because they didn't know what was happening. Maybe they thought if they went hard on defending Servius, then and then Servius becomes utterly done or completely done, then they will be in trouble. So they kind of just went along, and Lucius sits on the throne, and he starts addressing the Senate, and he tells them of his charges against the king, that is Servius. And he tells them that the king was, number one, a slave, so he's not qualified to be the king, that Servius was a slave, he wasn't supposed to be the king, that he was pandering to the poor, the commons, and taking things from the nobles and giving them to the poor. And he uses Servius giving out land to the commons as one example of that. He talks of Servius's hatred for the nobility. He talks about Servius making the nobility to pay for things and to take up more financial responsibility in the kingdom, and things like that. While he's giving this address, Servius, of course, hears that Lucius is in the Senate and he's sitting on the throne, and Servius Tullius comes rushing in. He comes, and this is what he asks. He asks the young Tarquinius. He asks him, "What is the meaning of this, Tarquinius? With what assurance have you dared, while I live, to convey the fathers or to sit in my chair?" And Tarquinius just tells him that he was sitting in his own father's seat. Like, this was the seat of my fathers, that is Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, and I deserve, or it's my right to sit on this seat, is basically what he was telling him. So there was this argument between them. And at this point, there are few people surrounding Servius Tullius, the king who is about to be removed from power. And this argument goes on, and Tarquinius walks over to where Servius is, and he holds him, and he takes him out, and he flings him down the steps of the Senate. Remember, Servius is an old man at this point. and he falls down. And when everybody who was around him sees this happening, they are like, Servius is done, so it's better we run away from him so that we don't find ourselves in trouble with Lucius, who is seemingly is going to be the next king. So they kind of like leave him alone. Like Servius is left exposed alone. Nobody wants to be associated with him. And Servius picks himself up and he starts walking, going home. And as he's walking, going to his house, it turns out Tullia, his own daughter, remember, and Lucia, they plan that some guys will follow him and murder him, basically. And some guys follow him while he's on the way going home, and they finish him. And now something happened that Livy describes as a source of the curse that followed Lucius and Tullia for the rest of their ruling and even after. And that is that after Servius is dead, he's left on the side of the road. And not long after that, Tullia is riding on a cart, horse-pulled cart. And as they are coming, the person who is leading the horses looks and he sees the king, and he's like, Tullia, look over there, Servius is lying on the road there dead. And Tullia tells the rider to make sure the cart just moves on top of his body, basically. And that's what happened. And Livy tells us that when the carriage drove over Servius' body, it picked the blood of the dead king. And with that blood, Tullia goes with that blood to her own house, which basically becomes a source of the curse for their family and the reign that now had started. By the time Servius had ruled for 44 years when he died, and that was from around 570s to 530s BCE. Livy says this about Servius Tullius. He says that at least the end of his reign, he says that maybe it wasn't necessary for Lucius to do what he did, at least if he was doing it for the good of the Romans, because at that point there were talks that Servius was considering resigning. Before that happened, in fact, there was talk. Livy tells us that reading several documents, it was knowledge among some quarters that Servius was considering resigning. So maybe if they had just left him alone, he would have resigned. But of course, that might also mean that somebody else would have become the king and not Lucius Tarquinius.